Welcome to our training on required documentation for case managers. This training includes watching this video and reviewing the 65E15 regulations, which describe the documentation requirements for case managers in the state of Florida. These regulations are attached to this lesson in the lesson media section of the lesson. When you feel comfortable with the material in this lesson, you are required to complete the attached quiz with a passing score of at least 70% in order to complete this lesson. We hope that this lesson is useful for you in your work. There are a number of general guidelines that apply to completing clinical documentation. First, documents need to be accurate. We want to document what we have observed or what we have been told. If we are provided information from someone else, we want to record what we are told and who specifically told us. We want to report what we are told even if we may believe that the information may be incomplete or inaccurate. Next, our documentation should be timely. As busy as our professional lives are, it is difficult for us to remember accurate and complete information for very long. The best guidance is to complete documentation immediately. If that is not possible, then the next best option is to complete the documentation as soon after the contact as possible. Next, our documentation should be specific, concise, and descriptive. This is actually a balancing act between being concise and descriptive, as these concepts may seem to be in opposition to each other. In general, we want to be as brief as possible while assuring that the document provides the essential information. Additionally, we want to be as specific as possible. We want to use language that specifically describes our contact. Next, our documentation should be objective. We want to record what we have observed or what we have been told. We want to refrain from drawing conclusions or expressing our opinions. Where we are required to express a professional opinion, our documentation should clearly indicate that it is the writer's opinion, and the expressed opinion should be as limited as possible. Next, our documentation should be consistent. We want to avoid contradictory information in the clinical record. Where we must enter contradictory information, we want to explain as thoroughly as possible why the information is contradictory. For example, when a person served tells us that they have not used any illegal substances in the last 30 days, and our urine drug screen shows the presence of an illegal substance, this is contradictory information. We would want to indicate that the denial of use was what the person served said, and the drug screen was objective information. Next, our documentation should be comprehensive, logical, and reflect our thought process. The documentation should include our initial assessment and evaluation, any changes in the person's condition or situation through the course of treatment, and the final assessment and evaluation at the time of discharge. The documentation should include the rationale or justification for both the services rendered and the specific interventions that are used. Next, our documentation should be legible. With the expansion of electronic health records, this issue has become less of a concern. But for documents that are completed on paper and handwritten, we need to work very hard at our legibility. It is not good enough that we are able to read our writing. Others must be able to read our writing as well, as we will not be the only person who uses the clinical record. Next, our documentation should be clear. Do not use ambiguous language, as others may be required to use the information that we have entered, and they need to be able to accurately understand what we have written. Next, we want to use the words of the person served wherever possible. Exactly what the person says provides the most accurate information. If we are documenting the person's exact words, we want to use quotation marks. If we are paraphrasing, then we don't use quotation marks. A word of caution here. We don't want to try to write a transcript of our contact with the person. We would want to use the person's words only for critical information. Writing everything that the person says will take way too much time for our documentation and will lead to much extraneous information in the document. The problem is that critical information may be hidden with unimportant information if we write too much. Next, any activity or contact related to the person served is to be included in the clinical record. This includes any contacts directly with the person served, whether in person or by telephone. It also includes any contacts with others in the person's life and contacts with other professionals or organization when that contact relates to the person served. It also includes documentation of no-shows and cancellations and our activities to reschedule these appointments. Next, our documentation should include the date of the contact and an original signature of the person making the entry. For paper documents, the person making the entry should sign the document. For electronic documents, an electronic signature is acceptable. Signatures should include the person's full name, any relevant degree, professional title, and an identification number if the staff person is given one. Use of a signature stamp on paper documents is prohibited. Next, documentation by the person providing therapy or counseling services will also be included in the clinical record, regardless of whether the individual is licensed by the state or not. Therapy or counseling services are a part of the record and should comply with all of these guidelines. Okay, we're almost done here. Our documentation on paper documents should be written in pen using only black ink. The only exception to this is that some documents require the signature to be in blue ink so that an original document can be differentiated from a copy of the document. Next, we want to refrain from any comments in the clinical record that may be critical of any other treatment or service provider. We want to refrain from comments that may be critical of the person served or which shows a judgmental attitude or any bias. Essentially, all of our documentation in the clinical record should be professional. Finally, it is important that our documentation in the clinical record be consecutive in time and date order, usually with the most recent documentation at the top. When using paper documents, we want to avoid empty lines or spaces in the documents. If there is a space in the document, a single diagonal line should be placed through the space. The next section of this presentation will discuss requirements for documentation of the assessment of the person served. First, all individuals who request case management services must receive an assessment. This assessment usually includes an administrative intake and a clinical assessment. The administrative intake includes the gathering of information and the completion of documents that are required for the person to be enrolled in services at the organization and to be enrolled in the case management program. These documents typically include the person's identifying and demographic information, emergency contact information, and medical and psychological historical information. At this time, the person served is to be provided information about the organization and the program, as well as information about the person's rights and responsibilities, and any fees that may be charged. Next, the clinical information includes all relevant functional domains for the individual. It should include historical information as well as current status. Most organizations have a standardized form, many times called a biopsychosocial assessment or a strength-based assessment, which is used for this purpose. For case management services, this assessment shall include an assessment of strengths, needs, abilities, and preferences of the person served. Next, the person completing the clinical assessment should complete a narrative review and summary of both the administrative intake information and the clinical assessment. This review should identify the specific needs of the person served that are appropriate for case management services. This narrative is to be signed by the person who completes the assessment. The assessment should include the information that is included on this slide and the next slide. Please take a moment to review these items. The assessment should include information listed here as well. Again, take a moment to review these items. The assessment is to be completed within 30 days of the person's entry into case management services. The state requirement is that a home visit be conducted prior to the completion of the assessment. If a home visit is not possible, information should be entered into the record that lists the reasons why a home visit could not be conducted. The next session on documentation will discuss the service plan. The service plan should include the goals and objectives for case management services. These goals and objectives should address the areas of weakness that have been identified in the assessment and should focus on increasing the self-sufficiency, role functioning, and independence of the person served. The ultimate goal of the case management service is to improve the quality of life for the person served. So our service plans should address any impairment in quality of life activities that are important to that person. Finally, the person served has all final decisions about goals and objectives for the service plan. To truly write an individualized service plan, the plan should reflect the desires of the person served, not what the case manager thinks the person should do. Next, the objectives in the plan should reflect concrete, measurable steps that the person served will take. These objectives should relate to the interventions that are also described in the service plan. I again want to emphasize that these are steps that minimally the person served agrees to, but preferably are steps that the person served generates. During the strength-based assessment, we should be identifying the person's strengths, needs, abilities, and preferences. And we should also identify how the person's mental health or substance use disorder has impacted his or her life. But in writing our goals and objectives, we want to focus on how the person served wants his or her life to be changed. While we can lead and guide, we should not identify what should be addressed. Only the persons served can identify how they want their lives to be changed. If a risk for dangerous behavior is identified during the assessment or at any time during the provision of services, it must be immediately addressed. If the risk is immediate and concrete, steps should be taken to assure the safety of the person served and others. If the risk is not immediate, the next option is to complete a personal safety plan. There is another training in this series that addresses personal safety plans. If appropriate, the service plan should be updated to include the steps to be taken to assure the safety of everyone. Next, if the person that we're serving has significant medical needs, we should ensure that the plan makes provisions to accommodate the medical needs of the person. Minimally, we should take every step possible to have effective communication with medical providers, including the completion of releases of information where necessary. Next, the service plan should reflect the person's expectations for services, and the person should provide informed consent for the services, including expected benefits and risks for these services. Where possible, the person's family should be included in the service planning process. Finally, when the service plan is complete, it is to be signed by the person served and the professional completing the plan. Service plans are to be completed within 30 days of the person's admission into the case management program, but only after the completion of the strength-based assessment. This slide presents a sample service plan. Please take a moment to review this plan. What did you think of the plan, given what we've discussed so far? Please take a moment to write down some of your comments. Here are some of the comments that I had. In the problem identification section of the plan, the language used does not appear to identify the problems from the person's perspective. Problem 1 might be better stated, as John says that it is hard for him to set goals for himself and achieve them. It might even be better stated, as John states that he is frustrated because he never seems to get anything done. The second problem statement on the slide is actually a restatement of the first problem. The change I would make to the third problem statement would be to put that in John's words instead of the more general description. The goal statement here on the plan is excellent. It identifies specific wants of the person, and it is written in the person's words. The objectives have a long way to go. First, these don't really appear to have been generated by the person served, as they are written in language that is specific to mental health services. The objectives have way too much professional jargon in them. And finally, these objectives identify outcomes, not action steps. What exactly is the person served going to do to learn skills for managing priorities, or being a good student, or identifying benefits, or asking for help? This slide provides some examples of objectives for case management services. Please take a moment to review these objectives. What do you think about these objectives? Please take a moment to write down some of your comments on these objectives. Oh my goodness, what can we say about these objectives? Again, these appear to be identified by the case manager and not the person served. What in the world is a linkage or advocacy effort? And have we ever heard a person served use those words? The third objective is an intervention because it identifies an action that the case manager, not the person served, will take. Better might be, John will attend the enrollment meeting at Southwest Florida State College on 5/2/20. Or, John will discuss his financial needs and needs for accommodations with the enrollment counselor at the 5/2/20 meeting. Or, John will attend the social mixer at the local community center on 5/3/20. Unfortunately, and perhaps sadly, if we reviewed actual service plans across the state, what we saw on these two slides would look very similar to what we would see. But we can do better. Hopefully, by reviewing these two slides and critiquing them, we have learned some of the things that we need to know to help us write better individualized service plans. Next, we're going to look at discharge and transfer summaries. A discharge summary is to be completed within 5 days of the person's last date of service. The discharge summary should tell the story of what happened during the service period. As I don't like to read to you, please take a moment to read this slide, as it provides information about what should be included in the summary. A transfer summary is completed instead of a discharge summary for individuals who are transferred rather than discharged. Again, please take a moment to read this slide as it provides information about the transfer summary. This slide provides you with a list of the standard information that is to be included in a progress note. If you are documenting a service contact with a person, then all of these elements should be addressed. However, if you are documenting a brief telephone contact, for example, then some of these items may be omitted as appropriate. Please take a moment to review this list. Our next to last slide in the presentation are some suggestions for documentation techniques. Again, I won't read these to you, so take a moment to read them. This completes our presentation on documentation for case management services. Please review the copy of the regulations that are provided in the lesson media section of this lesson. Additionally, a copy of the PowerPoint slides are provided for your convenience. When you are comfortable with this information, you are required to complete the attached quiz with a passing score of at least 70% in order to successfully complete this lesson. Thank you for your participation, and good luck with the quiz.